Hey, welcome back to Bridal Sewing Techniques, and today we're going to talk about how to hem with horsehair braid. Now, hang in there with me. I have 3 examples for you. Are you someone who has an experience with a mix of sewing but wants to get into the niche of bridal sewing? This channel is for you. Hit subscribe. So today we're going to go over how to hem with horsehair braid, including the latest trend of the wide horsehair braid, the 4-inch wide on the sheer organza. The next thing we're going to do is going to be the 1/2 inch, and that's going to have a narrowed rolled hem edge, and we're going to do that in one step. And then finally, we're going to do the 1-inch wide horsehair braid, and we're going to do that in 2 steps to get the rolled hem edge, just so you guys can see the difference and decide which way you're most comfortable with edging the hem. So as you can see, this is going to be a pretty long video, but it's also pretty comprehensive. So grab yourself a cup of hot tea and settle on in, and let's just see what all we can learn today. Now, before I started this video, I did separate the horsehair braid from the hem of the dress about 12 inches before or around, I guess I should say, both of the side seams. That frees up that horsehair braid from the fabric so that I could taper from the train up until the length that I need to be cutting this hem off at. Now, I've sped things up a little bit just so it's not too boring for you, but where I'm cutting is the final hem length plus my hem allowance that I need to roll the hem over the edge of the horsehair. Now, what is horsehair braid? Well, it's a nylon woven braid. It's kind of springy, and it gives body to the edge of the hem of the dress. So right now we're seeing a lot on sheer fabrics, but traditionally it's also been used in millinery. So you may have seen it on ladies' hats. All right, so what I need to do is I need to duplicate the taper. So I'm looking back at my original taper from the train up to the finished hem length, and I'm seeing about how long of a distance did it take for me to go from the original length to my new length. Okay, so it looks like, 10 inches or so. I'm going to duplicate that same cut on the same side. Now, if you want to get incredibly accurate with this, just go ahead and pin those 2 pieces together and use the piece that you cut first as your template to cut your second one identical. This is a very full skirt, so it's really forgiving. So I did just go ahead and copy it as best I could without worrying about measuring too much. All right, so I'm going to reuse this horsehair braid. I'm not going to use what I have in stock. So I'm going to separate. You can see where I'm gesturing here. I'm going to separate the horsehair braid from the original fabric that I just cut off. I'm going to use a razor blade to do that. The reason why I decided to reuse this horsehair braid, number one, is because you may not always have in stock the exact width to replace the braid after you remove it. So it's good for you to see that you can reuse it. The other reason was case specific. This horsehair braid was just a little bit more ivory than mine in stock. All right, now I'm showing you how I hook up the dress into my rigging system that is above my sewing machine. If you go to my channel, the homepage of my channel, Bridal Sewing Techniques on YouTube, and look under videos, I do have a video that goes over the rigging system for a bridal shop, and it'll show you more detail about this. But basically, it's going to hold the dress for you while you hem the dress. Because of all the loops in the ribbon that's dropping down, I get to adjust the height for each dress. All right, so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of unfurl this horsehair braid and get to the way that they sewed it. So I'm not having to figure this out or reinvent the wheel. I'm just going to dig in until I get to where they sewed the hem, and I'm going to set that under my presser foot and just take off sewing. So this is only going to require about 1/8 of an inch, and you can see I'm using my left invisible zipper foot. I love that foot. You will see I use my left or right invisible zipper foot most of the time for my sewing. It just gives me lots of room to work around where I'm working. I can see what I'm doing, and I can get really close to edges with it. So I'm basically just going to sew this across the whole bottom of the hem. So now I've edited till I get to the end of where I'm hemming, and what you're going to want to do is wherever it overlaps, the horsehair braid that's going to be on the outside needs to be folded in like I'm doing. Sometimes you need to stitch that down, sometimes you don't. Meaning sometimes you need to put a vertical stitch down that fold to hold it in place, but sometimes just that hem edge, and then you'll see we're going to do another row of stitches at the top of the braid. Sometimes that with pressing it is enough to hold it in place. You're just going to have to know the braid that you're working with. If it just keeps trying to spring out straight, then you need to go ahead and stitch it down a little bit. You can either do a vertical seam, or sometimes you can just tack it in a couple of places. Okay, so I have this jagged seam allowance in the organza that you can see. And when we roll this out and look at how it's going to look, you can see where the organza is kind of extra thick, and it just doesn't look good. So we're going to have to cut that little jagged corner off in there. The folds and everything else look like they're going to lay fine, so I'm not concerned about those. But when working with sheer fabrics, sometimes you do need to trim things up on the inside because it will be seen. All right, so now I'm going to sew down the top edge of the horsehair braid. When you get into the wider braids, they're more likely to flip down, and so they do require another row of stitching. Sometimes it's invisible thread that you use, and then other times I'm just using my regular ivory Gutermann, and that's just fine because there's actually an overlay that's going to go over this. And I'm gesturing again to a little extra bubble of fabric that I'm going to cut out of there because again it's going to be seen. Now when I'm sewing, I'm going to pull to the right and to the left to make sure that that hem roll is pulled nice and taut and everything is laying perfectly even. You don't want a bubble or anything pulling funny. And so you're just going to go ahead and sew the top edge of this horsehair braid across the whole front of the hem. And don't get too impressed. Here in a minute, I'm going to just speed it up double time for you so it's not boring, but you get to see everything that I'm doing. So I won't really be sewing that fast in real life. Now, as I said, the horsehair braid is there to give it a nice round springy body, And if there's kinks in the braid, it doesn't work that way. So you always want to press the horsehair braid out. Make sure there are no kinks in it. Okay, so for that 4-inch wide braid, the weave was kind of open, so you could use around a size 11 needle. I'm going to switch out now and I'm going to change to a 9-ball point because the braid that I'm getting ready to use, the weave is a little closer together. You're less likely to pull your fabric and to pull the braid if you use a 9-ball point. So I'm going to change my needle real quick, and then I'm also going to show you the information about the type of needle that I like to use. Now, as you saw, when I pulled the old needle out, I did kind of drag it along my finger to make sure there were no burrs on it so I could decide whether I needed to throw it away or keep it. In my experience, I find that a lot of seamsters don't really throw their needles away often enough. They're not expensive, so after you use them for a little while, don't be afraid to just toss them in the trash and get a fresh one. Your fabric is going to look so much better. Now here I'm going to heat seal the edge of this horsehair braid. You don't have to do that. Some of the braids actually turn black. If yours does that, then obviously skip that step and just go ahead and fold it in. And you're just going to kind of nest it inside the rolled hem that you opened up when you started your cut. All right, so I'm going to do this with a 1-step rolled hem. Don't forget, I do have the video on how to sew a perfect rolled hem. That only goes into the 1-step rolled hem. I do have a video coming up that's going to show you the 2-step for when you're sewing on the bias or something like that. But you don't have to use a 2-step just because there's a little curve in the hem. Don't be afraid of using the 1-step, and I'm going to show you that here in a little bit, how to deal with the curve. Now there is a little bit of a swooping down in this fabric that I'm coming up on. It just wasn't cut very straight, and as I discover that, I'm going to take my scissors and I'm just going to cut that extra little fabric out so that it'll lay nice and straight. So that is one of the very important points to being able to get a 1-step rolled hem to lay perfectly flat. That is, if your fabric bulges down just a little bit, don't be afraid, just like you're getting ready to see me do, don't be afraid to cut that little bulge out. Make sure it is a bulge in your fabric though, and that it's not something that's supposed to be there. So I'm just going to cut that out, and that's going to help out. The second step that is so critical to being able to get a 1-step rolled hem to lay very flat is that when the fabric is curving, you need to sew that curve into the fabric. You don't try to force the fabric through straight when the fabric is obviously going through a curve. So again, I'm going to show you that. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of that in this video. Here I am doing double time again, just so I don't bore you. But you can see here's a little bit of a curve, but it's tolerating it well. I just kind of forced it in there, and then once I pressed it, it laid down beautifully. And this is straight. You can see how much easier it's going through when it's on a straight segment of fabric. And this is also definitely not like an absolute perfection layer. This is one of the middle layers of the gown. So here's a high contrast view of how I roll as I sew. So we're on to our last segment of this tutorial. I hope you're learning a lot already. This is going to be the two-step rolled hem, and we're going to put in a 1-inch horsehair braid. All right, so I'm just kind of getting it started. There's a couple ways to do this. I cut first for this example, but a lot of you would have marked your hem, and then you would have compensated for how much hem ease you needed, and then you would have pressed that crease in there, and then you'd come over to the machine and sew right along that pressed line, and then you would cut away the excess, and then you would do your second step of rolling. But I just happen to cut first. I like to do that. I just like to not have the extra fabric, and it saves me the step of pressing. You can get by with it a little bit better too when you have a commercial sewing machine, because the pressure is so much better than a home sewing machine. Now I want you to see how much curve is in this fabric and how I'm dealing with it. You can see my left hand is swinging the fabric out to the left. That's what I'm talking about when I say sew into the curve. Don't force it to be straight. And that is going to make it lay so much flatter. But see how that fabric is going through in an arc and not in a straight line. You don't always want to fight your fabric. Sometimes you really just want to go with the flow, sense the spirit of the fabric, the way it's cut, the way that it's supposed to hang when it's done. A lot of times when you're fighting, that's when you're going to get those rumples. I cut that extra seam allowance out so that I don't get bulk in my roll. So I'm going to let you watch me run over that. It's so much better when you cut that extra seam allowance out in those side seams. So I'm gesturing to that curve again. I'm coming through a segment that's really curved up, and we want to keep on curving with it. So my left hand's going to be working a little to the left of the needle. Not enough curve to demand a two-step rolled hem. I very well would have done this in one step if I wasn't video recording. I just wanted to show you guys a wider range of choices that you have for putting in this type of hem. So you can kind of divide and conquer. If you feel like the hem is going to give you trouble just putting in the rolled hem, you don't want to complicate things and try to sew the horsehair braid in at the same time, especially if it's your first time sewing it, or you know, your first 50th time of sewing it. But I do want you to know you can do it either way. When you're starting out, you can separate the job, or you could also just do this in one step, and as long as you keep that curve going and just be patient and pay attention to what you're doing, it'll be fine. Okay, so I have rolled back this 1-inch horsehair braid and I sewed it. I put in that vertical stitch that I was talking about earlier to keep it flat. I just didn't feel like trying to get this roll in and fighting with that, having that down flat at the same time. And you can see I'm actually putting in a wider hem than what was originally in there. Originally it only had a 1/2 inch, but this needs a little bit more body in the front for this bride. All right, so I nested it down into the original hem, and now we're going to roll our second roll over the edge of this horsehair braid. This is going to be super easy because we already did the one roll, and the fabric just can't move around on you quite as much when it's stabilized with that row of stitches. So that's why a lot of seamsters would prefer to break this up into a couple of steps. It can just be a little less frustrating, but it is going to take longer. And again, I'm going to work with the curve the whole time. If you swing it out straight, that's when you're going to start to get rumples. Did you see how much that fabric rolls up straight and then you swing it out and it lays nice and flat? Look at the difference. I hope I'm really driving this point of the lesson home for you guys. I don't mean to be annoying, but you know, repetition is everything when you're learning, and it's such a key ingredient to getting these hems perfectly straight. Now, I apologize for this part being out of focus, but I think you can still tell what's going on, and it's really important. I'm going to show you me stitching in the ditch. That is putting in a little vertical stitch in one of the seams. So you're going to want to do this in each of your vertical seams, stitch in the ditch so that your horsehair braid won't flip out. If you don't have any seams that you can stitch in the ditch, or if it still continues to flip, you need to go in with an itty bitty blind stitch and tack that braid up. As always, I hope that this tutorial has helped you. Please visit again and rewatch it if you need to. More details will emerge. Please hit like, the thumbs up, hit subscribe, and then also share this with your seamster friends and in your social media sewing groups. It means the world to me. Comment down below if you do things a different way or if you have any questions. I'd be happy to help you.